So, there's kind of a problem for reading that book in the time in America or in Britain in the 80s. Another reason, I think, for her reluctance to be drawn into a specific critique of the Reagan or the Bush administration's failures lay in the fact to begin with that always, I think, she was more interested in foreign policy and overseas policy than domestic policy. That's not a criticism, it's an observation, it's who she was. It also, however, in another way, reflects her long-term dislike of sexual politics, by which I don't mean feminism. She was always, in her way, though she writes of herself specifically as a feminist, but she comes back throughout her entire career to women's issues and to the inequality of the positions of men and women at every level of discourse and the rest of reality. What she doesn't like is the identity politics of sexuality. And in this, she's very much of her generation, very different to my generation. Like James Baldwin, like so many others, like Gore Vidal, all those people for whom any notion of organising around object choice seemed to be something very strange. And again, this is a very Gallic position, a very Francophile position. Think how much people like Foucault and Barthes resisted any kind of identity politics. Why Emily White went to live in Paris? Why that whole intelligentsia kind of drooled over Paris? Again, this could drift off into another talk, so I'll cut that short there. She wrote in the book of sexual politics, by which she saw it, many male homosexuals reconstituted themselves as something like an ethnic group, one whose distinctive folkloric custom was sexual veracity, and the institutions of urban homosexual life became a sexual delivery system of unprecedented speed, efficiency, and volume. Well, there's lots that one could say about that particular comment, but I'll simply confine myself to the fact that she reads the entire emergence of modern lesbian and gay identity, not as a political response in any way, shape, or form to legal discrimination, but only as a byproduct of promiscuity, and entirely evacuating and excluding women from the picture. It is only a story of men as far as she's concerned. For her, gay sex is merely and simply a matter of appetite, which she notes with distaste, in a capitalist society, is supposed to be immoderate. Given the imperatives, she writes in the book about AIDS, about consumption and the virtually unquestioned value attached to the expression of self, how could sexuality not have come to be, for some, a consumer option, an exercise in liberty, of increased mobility, of pushing back the limits? There's nothing here about the sodomy laws, there's nothing here about being locked up, there's nothing here about persecution or suffering. It's actually a very strange, displaced, rather distasteful, I find, writing. But again, it's not unusual. I think there's very few of the intellectuals of her generation understood the enormity of America's change at that period, and also what it represented internationally. What Stonewall meant in '69 was something that had never been attempted before. For all one's doubts and reservations subsequently about identity politics, the way that identity politics can go, the downside of identity politics, the emergence in '69 of modern lesbian and gay identity was an extraordinary achievement. One of the greatest achievements of American liberal culture. And I won't say it's a gift to the world, but it's something that was explored and has its own generic histories locally, in Manchester, in London, in Paris, in Lille, in Berlin, everywhere else. But then the key issue there, the key image was an American one. That she never understood. And I think very few of her Puritan contemporaries understood that. There are many more implications there, but I'll move on. I think it's by contrast revealing, again, that at the height of the epidemic, she can only defend the term libertinism by analogy with modernist art, significantly comparing calls for a return to some mythical past of sexual restraint to, quote, the return to figure and landscape, tonality and melody, plot and character, and other much vaunted repudiations of difficult modernism. Much her best contribution to the epidemic came not in her book specifically about AIDS, but actually in a short story she wrote in The New Yorker, 2 years earlier, in 1986. It's a story with a British literary reference right in the middle of its title called The Way We Live Now. And with the greatest skill and insight, it's a story which depicts something that the book doesn't really begin to touch on, namely that whole miasma of fear and anxiety and voyeurism and anxiety surrounding the encroaching epidemic in the early years before the identification of HIV, mainly in the form of rumour and gossip, and the relations between men and women, and the relations between gay men and our straight friends, and our lesbian friends too. It was written à clé about the long, protracted, agonised death and dying of her friend Robert Mapplethorpe, as seen through the visits and the phone calls and the conversations and the waking up with nightmares in the middle of the night of his friends. The story is about it, which is never named. The word AIDS doesn't come into the story, and him. He is never named. This is not evasion. This is why it's such a great story, I think. At the time, she was criticised by some people for writing a subject, a story which wasn't sufficiently specific. That seemed to me politically naive and extreme. The great success of that story then and now was precisely that it explained reticence through reticence. It explained denial through displacement. The experiences she referred to in her life were usually far away in space and time. This was an analogy, as it were, to that distancing which had occasioned most of her best criticism. Alongside Alan Barnett's great story, The Times as It Knows Us, which was also first published in the New Yorker, and subsequently included in a slim volume of stories that he only just lived to see in 1990. I think that Susan Sontag's The Way We Live Now remains one of the key texts of the early testimonial literature of AIDS, a subject again which remains entirely unwritten as far as I'm aware. Somehow then I think the book on AIDS is a failure. It's fashionable. I mean, I could say something more about identity stuff, and I won't get on because I'm running out of time already. I always want to sing the praises of the American lesbian gay movement, partly because it gave me so much personally, because I do feel that we all owe it a great deal. But not only in America, but also the movement of people, thanklessly, you know, Joe Blow, everybody who campaigned to set up the switchboard movement in this country in 1974. I remember the first lesbian gay phone switchboard conference in Manchester, the first time I ever came here in my life, in 1974. And that was an extraordinary movement. It didn't come out of the campuses. It wasn't given from on high. It wasn't donated by governments or by local or national. It came out of need, real need, and out of ordinary people. It was an extraordinary political movement. And to sneer at that in the way that so many academics then did, and still do, I do find insupportable. But there I probably show my age. I'd also like to remind you, and I think it probably does need to be said, that today, the 10th of October, is the 14th anniversary of the death of Paul Matthew Shepard. You know, that poor boy, you know, in Wyoming who was dragged home many miles alive, you know, and then left crucified on barbed wire, you know. And it's also the week which is the 7th anniversary of the death of assistant bar manager Jody Dabrowski in Clapham Common in 2005. You know, those things haven't gone away. One can't just smoothly say, oh, identity politics, boo. Something needs to be done. There has to be organisation. And the political movement which sprang in relation to lifetimes of real and petty cruelties, as well as terrible injustice, involved a remarkable coalition of ordinary people, infuriated and wounded into the construction of confident institutions. This was one of the most remarkable political achievements in modern America. It took enormous collective time and effort, and the AIDS activist movement grew out of that, in America as here. In that, Susan Sontag, like many of her leftist contemporaries, took no interest whatsoever. As I say, I don't think she was terribly interested in sexuality. The Way We Live Now shows that she actually was at the keenest imaginable antennae to the way in which sexuality does in fact feed out into all our lives all the time, but such were her contradictions. And one of the reasons I think that Regarding the Pain of Others is, by contrast, a great book, is that it plays, by contrast, to her greatest strengths. The non-medical literature of pain is actually very small, surprisingly small. We know about analgesics in the medical department at the University of Manchester, but when it comes to cultural analgesics, there's not many people to turn to who've made their lives in that area. Everything that Susan Sontag recoiled as a modernist against documentary, with its implicit notions of truth, against what she saw as journalism. Yet film and photography absolutely fascinated her. And she was, by temperament, in any case, better suited to write, I think, about representations than about what is represented. All the way through her life, one sees her return to rhetoric. If one wants to summarise what she did, she wrote about rhetoric. She doesn't use the word rhetoric very often at all, unlike Laura Bart, but that's what she was. She was a rhetorician. Above all, this is an argument, again, with her earlier work, what she'd written in her wonderful book on photography, which is a book, which is wonderful, but you have arguments with it. You wake up thinking, still now, oh God, that's so stupid, oh, that's so brilliant. What I like about Susan Sontag's work is it stays in your head. She's one of those people like friends you really love, who die, who stay with you because you have blazing rows with them. Not because you just boo-hoo cry and miss them. People you really love, I think, are the ones you carry on having arguments with in your head. And I've been having arguments in my head with Susan Sontag since I was 16, so I have a kind of, that's the grounds of my affection. I'm going to again skip forward, because when I read this to myself, this was all very much shorter than it seems now.